January 12, 1954. For the first time since Stalin's death, the old archive wing of Lubyanka was opened. The corridors were colder than the winter outside, the kind of cold that gnaws into the bones and makes every breath feel borrowed. As the iron door to the sealed room groaned open, the sound echoed like a forgotten memory trying to escape. The air inside had not moved in years. It smelled of dust, mold, and something darker, something metallic, like the residue of vanished lives. The dim light caught the edges of a wooden crate, alone in the center of the room, untouched since the final days of Stalin's rule. Its ropes were still tied in the tight, methodical knots used by the old NKVD couriers. When the bindings were cut, the lid lifted, as if the crate exhaled. Inside, stacked with unsettling precision, lay dozens of leather-bound folders, black, heavy, edges worn from the hands of men who rarely hesitated. Across each cover, stamped in fading ink, was a single word: Rastrel, execution. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence carried a weight that felt older than the Soviet Union itself. The first folder was opened. A thin sheet of yellowed paper slid forward, and on its top corner was a red mark, sharp, decisive, unmistakable. Beneath it, a signature written with the kind of confidence only a man accustomed to absolute power could possess: Stalin. It was not a rumor, not a forged tale whispered by dissidents, not an exaggeration crafted by enemies of the state. It was his handwriting, his approval, his list. Name after name filled the pages, each line representing a life already taken or soon to be taken. Some names belonged to generals who once stood proudly beside Stalin during the victory over Hitler. Others were scientists, teachers, farmers, or men and women whose identities had never made it into the grand narrative of Soviet glory. It became clear within minutes that this crate was more than a relic of bureaucracy. It was a ledger of death, a testament to a ruler who feared shadows more than armies, and who believed the pen could kill as efficiently as any bullet. And yet, this was only the beginning. Over the next 18 months, the officers assigned to the archive would catalog more than 7,000 such names, each one marked, approved, and scheduled by the man who commanded an empire through terror. What they had opened was not a box of documents. It was the unfinished business of Joseph Stalin. To understand the magnitude of what those officers uncovered, one must understand the state of the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. A nation held together not by trust, but by fear, suspicion, and the unchallenged will of Joseph Stalin. For nearly 3 decades, Stalin had ruled an empire that stretched across 11 time zones. But behind the triumphs carved into granite monuments lay a system built on silence and controlled by shadows. The Great Terror of the 1930s had shattered families, uprooted entire communities, and filled the gulags with millions. But the terror did not fade after the purges. It simply became quieter, more methodical, and in many ways even more dangerous. By the end of his life, Stalin had grown increasingly paranoid. He trusted no one, not his generals, not his closest advisors, not even the men who guarded him. The war against Hitler had made him a hero, but victory had only deepened his obsession with invisible enemies. He believed conspiracies were everywhere, in universities, in theaters, in factories, in his own secret police.
To him, every whisper was a threat, and every disagreement was treason. The Soviet people knew only fragments of this reality. They heard the slogans, the speeches, the promises of progress. But the machinery of repression operated far from public view, inside offices where a single red mark on a piece of paper could determine whether a person lived or died. To question the system was to disappear into it. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin's influence remained absolute. Ministers competed to anticipate his wishes. Intelligence chiefs supplied him with endless lists of supposed traitors, each hoping to prove their loyalty by uncovering more enemies than the last. But the most haunting truth was simple. Stalin did not merely approve lists of executions. He personally revised them, edited them, expanded them. The signatures discovered in the archive were not mere formalities. They were decisions, human lives compressed into handwriting. When Stalin died in March of 1953, the immediate reaction within the inner circle was not grief, it was confusion. There was fear that hidden directives, unfinished orders, or sealed lists might surface and destabilize the emerging leadership. The Soviet Union was trying to reshape its future while still drowning in the secrets of its past. This was the environment in which those files were found. A fragile state grappling with the legacy of a man who had built a fortress of terror and then left it behind like a ticking device. And the implications were devastating. If these lists were revealed, they would prove beyond doubt that Stalin intended to continue the purges until his very last breath. They would expose the scale of injustice committed against the Soviet people. They would undermine the myth of the benevolent father figure the regime had so carefully crafted. But perhaps the most dangerous consequence was this. The lists showed names of individuals who were still alive, people living ordinary lives, unaware that their death had once been scheduled, approved, and only delayed by the dictator's sudden collapse. Each name was not just a record, it was a reminder that Stalin's terror had been poised to continue for years, possibly decades, had fate not interrupted him. In the face of these revelations, the Soviet leadership found itself at a crossroads. To bury the truth along with Stalin, or confront a past so dark it threatened to unravel the very system he created. This was the weight the officers felt in those first days of the investigation. They were not simply reading history, they were touching the last cold breath of Stalin's tyranny.
As the weeks passed, the discovery in the sealed archive began to spread through the upper floors of Lubyanka like a controlled whisper, quiet enough to avoid panic, loud enough to unsettle every man who heard it. The files were too detailed, too organized, too personal, and the question everyone feared lingered in the air. What should be done with Stalin's death lists? Inside the NKVD leadership, a silent war began, one fought not with bullets, but with caution, calculation, and self-preservation. Some argued the lists should never see daylight. They believed the documents were poison, capable of destabilizing the new Soviet identity being carefully constructed by Khrushchev. To them, exposing Stalin's final orders would invite questions the government could not afford to answer. They feared public outrage. They feared internal rebellion. But more than anything, they feared their own fingerprints on the machinery of terror. Others, however, saw an opportunity, not for justice, but for survival. If Stalin alone could be blamed for the purges, then the men who carried out his orders could recast themselves as obedient instruments, not willing accomplices. By revealing the lists, they could shift responsibility upward, onto a man who could no longer defend himself.
And in the shadows between these two factions stood the officers assigned to examine the documents, men like Major Sokolov and Lieutenant Chernenko. They were not high-ranking enough to influence policy, yet too deeply involved to pretend ignorance. Every day they opened new folders, and every day the numbers grew. A playwright who had written a line Stalin disliked, a colonel whose loyalty was insufficiently enthusiastic, a mother accused of teaching her children politically ambiguous jokes, a scientist whose research contradicted one of Stalin's theories. The lists were not merely bureaucratic, they were personal. Stalin had annotated margins with short comments, sometimes a terse guilty, sometimes a cryptic question mark, sometimes nothing more than a chilling red line. And it became clear that many on these lists had never been arrested, never interrogated, never warned. They were people living quietly, unaware that their names had been written in the final chapter of Stalin's life. The officers scrutinizing the folders began to recognize patterns, geographical clusters, professional categories, entire sectors of society targeted in waves. They found lists connected to the infamous doctor's plot, others labeled cosmopolitans, pessimists, speculators, foreign sympathizers. The deeper they read, the more they understood. These were not remnants of old purges. These were preparations for new purges, comprehensive, systematic, and imminent. Stalin had been planning a second terror, and then the atmosphere became even darker. In late spring of 1954, Sokolov uncovered a folder thicker than the rest. Its edges were crisp, its ink fresh compared to the others. At the top, a handwritten title, Second Wave, Spring. Below it, 348 names, stamped, approved, marked for immediate action. The date was the part that struck like a blow to the chest. March 4th, 1953, 3 days before Stalin died. It was not the final list. It was the next one. In that moment, the officers realized the horrifying truth. The dictator had been preparing for another purge, even as his health was failing. The machine of terror had not slowed with age. It had been accelerating. But the conflict did not stop there. When Sokolov reported the discovery to his superior, the reaction was instantaneous and violent. The man slammed his fist on the table. "Seal it," he ordered. "Seal everything. No more lists, no more revelations." Others disagreed, insisting the leadership must confront the documents, face the consequences, begin a new era. Arguments erupted behind closed doors. Accusations flew. Old loyalties fractured. Private fears became public weapons. The NKVD was not debating history. It was fighting over its own future, over guilt, over survival, over truth. And the lists themselves became symbols of a deeper struggle, a struggle between the shadows of the past and the fragile hope of a different tomorrow. In that chaotic, shifting power structure of post-Stalin Moscow, one thing became painfully clear. No one could control what the files represented. Not the men who created them, not the men who hid them, not the men who found them. Because every page, every signature, every meticulously written name forced the same question into the minds of all who read them. If Stalin had lived just 7 more days, how many of us would still be alive?
The confrontation came in the summer of 1954. When the investigation could no longer be contained within basement corridors and whispered conversations. The lists had grown too large, the implications too heavy, the truth too dangerous to manage quietly. The highest officials of the Soviet state were summoned, men accustomed to power, accustomed to secrecy, but unprepared for what they were about to face. For hours, the atmosphere in Moscow had been strangely tense, as if the city itself sensed that something buried for years was finally clawing its way to the surface. When the meeting began, the archives team presented their findings, not with emotion, not with accusation, but with the cold precision of men forced to narrate a nightmare. 7,041 names, approved, scheduled, authorized in handwriting unmistakably Stalin's. As the report unfolded, something inside the room shifted. The facade of control began to crack. Some officials leaned forward, gripping the table as if steadying themselves against a rising tide. Others stared at the floor, refusing to lift their eyes, terrified that they might see their own guilt reflected in the documents. When Major Sokolov read the date of the final list, March 4, 1953, the silence broke like shattered glass. A voice burst out, trembling with disbelief. "This cannot be genuine. Stalin was gravely ill. He could not have been signing names." But then the folders were opened, one by one. Pages turned with the soft, damning rustle of paper that carried the weight of thousands of extinguished destinies. Stalin's red pencil marks, sharp, deliberate strokes, glowed against the yellowed pages like wounds that had never healed. And suddenly the room erupted. Shouts collided, accusations tore through the air. Men who had served Stalin for decades refused to believe what they were seeing, refused to accept that the man they had worshipped could have intended to continue the terror until his final breath. Others insisted the lists must be revealed, if only to save themselves. They argued that only by exposing Stalin's intentions could the new leadership absolve itself of complicity. One official cried openly, not out of sorrow for Stalin, but because he recognized a name on the list, his own brother. Another man stood trembling, barely able to speak as he realized that two of the scientists whose work he relied on daily had been slated for execution. They had lived only because Stalin's heart failed before the machinery could be set in motion. And in that boiling chaos, the central truth became undeniable. Stalin had not intended reform. He had not been slowing down. He had been preparing to plunge the nation into a new wave of purges, swift, broad, and merciless. The room turned into a storm of human voices, clashing fears, and unanswerable questions. Men who had built their careers on loyalty now understood that their lives had been hanging by a thread far thinner than they had ever imagined. Every folder was a verdict, every signature a death sentence, every name the echo of a life Stalin had tried to erase. And by the time the shouting subsided, one chilling realization settled over the room like falling ash. Stalin had been seconds away from rewriting the fate of thousands. The only force that stopped him was death itself. His, not theirs.
When the investigation finally ended, after 18 long months of sifting through shadows, the officers compiled their final report. 7,041 names. 7,041 destinies redirected by the sudden stopping of one man's heart. Some of those named were already gone, silenced in prisons, buried without markers, remembered only by the absence they left behind. Others were still alive, living quiet lives, unaware that their death had once been scheduled with the confidence of a man signing a simple administrative order. But the most haunting truth was not the number of names. It was the revelation that Stalin had never intended to slow the terror. He had planned its expansion. He had been mapping new targets, preparing fresh purges, designing a future carved from fear. He had been ready to begin again. The men who studied those lists came away changed. They spoke less. They slept poorly. They walked through crowded streets and found themselves looking at strangers, wondering how many other lists might be hidden in forgotten rooms, how many decisions had been made about lives that would never know it. Some of the officers who handled the documents disappeared from the official record soon after the report was filed. No announcements, no explanations. A silent footnote in a system that preferred that uncomfortable truths sink quietly into the depths. But the folders survived, locked away, cataloged, preserved in rooms colder than any winter outside. In time, historians would debate the exact numbers. They would argue over interpretations, motivations, intentions. But the red pencil strokes in those folders were not theories. They were not myths. They were not political fabrications. They were Stalin. Unfiltered, unmasked, undeniable. And as the years passed, a strange irony emerged. The dictator who sought to erase thousands from existence ended up leaving behind the most incriminating evidence of all, his own handwriting. Signatures that had once condemned men now condemned him. Marks made in seconds became the most enduring testimony of the world he built from fear. In the end, the lists revealed what many had suspected but few had dared to confront. Stalin's legacy was not triumph or unity or progress. It was a ledger of lives he believed he had the right to extinguish. And though the regime attempted to bury the truth beneath layers of secrecy, dust, and silence, the files remained. Proof that even the most powerful ruler cannot rewrite history forever, because paper outlives fear, ink outlives dictators, and in the quiet of those archives, one truth echoes louder than all the propaganda that once filled the streets. Stalin ended thousands of lives, but it was his own death that finally ended the terror.